Welcome to Escapists Anonymous, the fantasy fiction book club. I'm Dan.
And I'm Sam.
And this is episode 2, where we'll be discussing chapters 20 through to the end of Hannah Kaner's Godkiller. So strap in for analysis, theories, and spoilers as we catch up on what Kissen and the gang have been getting up to.
So, we last left our heroes, our central four characters, at a bit of a dramatic point in the storyline. We just had a fight between Kissen and Elo, and Skedi had just betrayed Inara by taking control of her body, unleashing some kind of heretofore unknown power that she had within herself. So we've had big drama, but potentially this is going to lead to the gang being more closely bonded than ever before, leading into the final fight. So, Dan, reflections on where we left our main characters. How do you feel it's all going?
I think it was certainly a sort of make or break moment for the gang, as I will call them from here on in. And I think it's interesting immediately afterwards, as we get into the second half of the book, that there's this new respect, certainly from Kissen towards Elo. Elo hasn't been as confrontational as Kissen has up until now, but there seems to be an understanding between them. He's particularly impressed by her fighting and her street smarts, the method she used to kind of overcome his very well trained King's Guard fighting methods. Yeah. So I think it was the moment where you feel like they're going to maybe become friends now.
Yeah, I mean, the tensions that existed in the group the gang prior to this, it shifted because there was a hostility there, but now there's still kind of disagreements, but it's about them staying together. You know, later on in the novel, when Elo wants to leave, Kissen and Nara are like, no, you have to stay. And we see that shortly afterwards here, don't we? Because, you know, Elo says, I'm going to go. And she's like, no, we need you here. We're all going the same way to Blenraden, so you might as well stay with us. But as the facade falls away a little bit later, she kind of says like, no, we should all just stay together because, you know, we all like each other. And perhaps a little bit more than that.
She would never say that.
No.
It would be expressed in some form of rage or anger.
Yeah. But I do feel, though, that this fight, it was a little bit like foreplay metaphor kind of thing, wasn't it? They're sussing each other out. They're testing each other's little boundaries. It really felt like this was initial kind of them opening up to each other because they'd now had this kind of physical altercation. Because you can see where Elo, after the fight, he starts noticing her body beyond the armor. He notices that she has freckles beyond the burns. He notices like the way that the scars and tattoos on her body sit behind her armor. Like he's literally now looking beyond just that front of the armor, and he kind of directly ties Kissen and Aaron together, like kind of associating her as being one of the closest people to him.
I have to admit, at this point, I still didn't sense any romance on the cards between the two of them.
No, this is me having had a second read through.
Okay.
But I was similar to you. My first read through, I thought that, no, they're not going to do a romance thing. Like, and we'll come to that when it happens later, and how much we think it is an effective kind of denouement between their characters. Just quickly with Inara and Skedi, one thing I was wondering about, thinking back about when we get up to this point, is Skedi's lies up until this point. They are influencing people, like, don't notice us, you know, the old lady, oh, your hips don't hurt, you know, when you're walking. With this one, he takes direct control of her how is this an extension of lying?
Yeah, my assumption was that it was the bond, that he wouldn't be able to take control of Kissen or Elo. He had to try and influence them through lying. But because he's bonded to Inara, he could influence her in a much more physiological way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And we still don't know the extent of his powers. Yeah, he is referred to as a little god, but there is a sense that he could have at some point been something more. One of my little theories is his powers could have extended beyond to being some quite major, but I'll pick up on that when we get to it in a little bit. And it would just be a theory. So when you hear it, feel free to just knock it back and just say, it's rubbish. So moving forward, chapter 20, we start off with Elo, and he's having this flashback of Aaron, this failure of falling for a god's power, and how Elo feels about these moments of weakness and how he's tying them all up together.
I think the really interesting thing here is that it seems like he's having a full-on post-traumatic stress episode. And whilst we've had reference to that PTSD stuff, I think here he's fully kind of flashing back to something, and his body is in one place and his mind is in another, and it's Kissen almost shakes him out of it.
Yeah. I mean, PTSD, from people who've seen combat, we all know of it in modern warfare contexts, but in fantasy, your heroes, your knights, they don't tend to suffer from those so much. There's less of that kind of introspection about, how they feel about the death and destruction they've seen.
My assumption here is that the fight is kind of what's triggered the episode. And then as we move into chapter 21, he doesn't get a lot of time before he's forced into the fray again. And we know, based on Kissen's knowledge of the gods, that it's that night that they're going to have to prepare to face another set of demons.
I like how she has that knowledge, and it gives us the other sense of, as much as gods are chaos, there's these kind of like predictable patterns. That's the way in which the Vega can understand and control these gods. I like the idea that these gods can fall for the Vega's little trinkets. Like, I am a powerful god of this forest. Oh, what is that? A prayer? Oh, lovely. Oh, they're just like, because they like jumping for a little treat.
Yeah, it's kind of setting up the gods as adversaries, but not adversaries that are all powerful, so to speak.
Yeah, but then jumping back, so the shadow summons arrive, they have this other fight, and then after they think they've defeated the summons, then you've got another standoff with these chancers who are trying to steal their horse legs, and then they scare them off. And these are real good moments to help bring Skedi back into the fold of being trusted, because he's the one who kind of steps up.
Yeah, and it definitely shows that he's capable of more than he's letting on a lot of the time. But there's a question here of whether he comes to Inara's defense because he knows that she's furious with him and it's an opportunity to get back in her good books.
It can be both, though. It can be all of that thing. It's like,
that's true.
Because, he's done it before. Like, he wanted to control her, not just because he was enjoying the sense of the power, but also because he genuinely thought it was best for Inara and himself. Like, I think that's why he's quite an interesting, complex character, because he does have all those motivations. He wants to save himself, but he also loves Inara, and he wants to get back into her good books.
So they fight off the demons, but in doing so, Elo uses his arm as a shield and gets a pretty nasty injury. And then after the battle, I think this is where, whether it's romance or just physical attraction, Kissen sort of tends Elo's wounds with her mouth.
Yeah. It's a very visceral and, very openly physical approach to dealing with that, isn't it? It's very in keeping with who Kissen is as a character. Like, she won't think twice about it. It's like, we need to get that tooth out. I'm going to pull it out. I'm going to use my teeth. It's an example of where she doesn't have the compunctions that others might have.
Yeah. At this point, also, there's a bit of a shift in the way Kissen looks at Skedi after he's put himself out there in order to help them. She uses his name for the first time.
Yeah. It's just one of those small concessions. And it's nice. It doesn't go too far. It doesn't have Kissen stepping forward going, you know what? You're all right. That kind of thing. It's like without having to say it. So after this fight, they go and wash off in that lake. And again, you think you're going to have a nice, relaxing bit where they're all washing and they're just having this bonding experience. But suddenly they spot Elo's curse on his shoulder. And we're back into a whole other drama. I mean, it was nice to have this resolution of, oh, this is where they're coming from. And I didn't guess it was going to be him.
No, and I was really enjoying the kind of post-fight bliss. They were allowing themselves to enjoy the moment, and they were bathing in the lake, and Kissen had taken off her prosthetic limb, and Inara had seen the mountains glowing, and Kissen was enjoying that Inara was seeing this for the first time. And I think it's here that she admits to herself that traveling with company is way better than traveling alone.
Yeah.
Which is quite a big thing for someone like Kissen to even think out loud in her head. And then, yeah, shit hits the fan when they spot the curse on Elo's back.
Now, them piecing together that Canavan, who I'd completely forgotten about as a character, like it was very good for it to be like, oh yeah, that whole event. I completely moved on from from that whole thing. But they're like, oh, it must have been him because I saw that thing and we traced it back. Did you feel it was a bit of a stretch, or do you think that they're logicking out of, oh, it must have come from him, made sense?
I bought it at the time. Definitely. I think there's logic to it in terms of when the attacks started.
Yeah, I feel like they really go out of their way to tie it back. And I think that's interesting because we don't go back to Canavan again in this book. So for them to like, oh, it's this specific character and he did this, I don't feel there was enough of a resolution within this book about Canavan as a character. And this is that thing I brought up in the last episode where things about trilogies kind of annoy me sometimes, because this is clearly planned as a trilogy rather than chunk it out as one huge book that's like 1,200 pages. I get that. But I'm reading this one book, and you've introduced this character who's done this thing that has huge ramifications, and while the curse is resolved by the end of it, it felt like, oh, they're not going to go back, they're not going to deal with this until a later book. Well, I want sometimes these books to be treated as more kind of contained standalone stories within a larger arc. And I feel that was one element here that was too Marvel Cinematic Universe.
I do think just that is the world of epic fantasy, and I like having the untied off things to come back to. It gives me an extra motivation to pick up the next one.
Look, I'm not saying it ruins them. I'm not saying it like I'm nitpicking here. I'm just saying like, it definitely serves its purpose. I know I'm going to read the full trilogy and I'm sure the guy's going to come back. But if I wanted to read this as a standalone adventure, I can't and have it be satisfying.
It is varied, but I love a long haul, and I loved the Avengers.
Oh no,
MCU.
I enjoy all of it as well. But it's a choice that's made. It's not one that, I don't think this is an oversight. I think she intentionally mentioned this character to draw into whatever happens in the future books. It's a choice, but it has its pros and cons.
Yeah. No, you're right. And I'm right. There's no wrong answers here.
Then we have that very short chapter where Inara reflects upon her mother's involvement with the rebellion.
Yeah, the main takeaway from this is that Kissen refers to Inara as Lady Kreia, and it's this kind of moment of realization in Inara's head that she is actually, Lady Kreia now. She is the heir to the Kreia manor.
Yeah. Now, 24, short little chapter, and it's kind of a bit of a set piece that is just Elo and his train of thought. And I thought this worked really well because it starts with him being panicked about failing on his mission for Aaron, what he's got to do. And, you know, you've got that Elo who we've seen in previous chapters worrying about his failings with we saw it a few chapters ago where he thought about how he was failing Aaron, the fight where he let Aaron almost die, all that kind of stuff. But this time we have a new thing that comes in. It steadies him mentally. He's thinking about Kissen, including thoughts of naked Kissen, you know, and thinking about her in that kind of physical sense. And we can see how those two characters are becoming intertwined in his affections. And what's interesting is now we have that transition from him being panicked about Aaron to actually using the thoughts of Kissen to ground him. And he's having that fireside scene with Kissen where she's like, you know, wrapped up and, you know, they're trying to keep warm by the fire. And his mind keeps jumping around where he's enjoying being with her. And it's allowing him to move away from Aaron as this quasi-homosocial kind of relationship, this really intense relationship that he's had with Aaron for all these years, and he's transposing some of that affection towards Kissen. And it's really nice, and I think it's a really believable way that we're seeing this relationship develop. And the short chapter ends with him thinking about Aaron again, but he feels more confident because of these interactions with Kissen.
The thing that made me laugh was Elo trying to sort of gauge whether Kissen's actually interested in him. He's sort of really fishing in quite an obvious way. It's like, is that the only reason you like having me around?
He's desperate.
As though he wants her to say something like blatant, like, no, I really want to hook up with you or something.
But do you like me like me?
Yeah. But yeah, I felt like this was very much a chapter to kind of move along that idea of the way the two of them have sort of noticed each other now. So a couple of chapters ago, as Elo walked into the lake, she sort of in her head notices his powerful legs and in quite a sexual way.
Oh my! Oh.
And now you've got Elo thinking about Kissen naked.
Yeah. And I think that's it. For me at this point, I'm like, yeah, there's a physical attraction, but the way Kissen approaches sexual relationships, you know, it can be combined with you liking the person emotionally, but she's quite free and easy about it. You think about how she thought about the barmaid, you know, in the first half of the book, and how she sometimes sees it as a sexual relationship being intertwined with friendship rather than love. And I was like, oh, she's going to just have this casual friends with benefits situation with Elo rather than the passion it kind of seems to develop into.
Yeah, and I guess it speaks maybe to my unconscious biases that I just assumed because of that interaction with the barmaid earlier that was her orientation, and obviously she's a lot more fluid than that.
Moving on, they're now getting into Blenraden. We have a few chapters that kind of really flow together about their journey into the edge of Blenraden, leaving Legs the horse behind, sneaking in through some secret tunnels, and then we arrive into the city. And there's a whole sequence of really gripping descriptions that give you a sense of what the city used to be like and what it's like now. So when they sneak in and they arrive in this great hall where it's the aftermath of the event that killed the queen, Aaron's mother, and then the trauma that had happened to him, and they just left everything apart from some other bodies.
Yeah, I was really surprised by the depiction of Blenraden. I think it wasn't what I expected it to be. I think I was really expecting this absolute ghost town.
But it is a bit like that, isn't it?
I think it's a bit like that, but there's also a lot more going on there than I really expected there.
Yeah.
So we find out that the pilgrimages are pretty much common knowledge to the King's Guard. I wasn't expecting there to be King's Guard there. I thought it would be kind of abandoned ground, really.
Like a wasteland. No one goes there anymore.
Yeah. But there's this kind of delicate balance or peace that's being struck. It's kind of one part corruption that benefits the King's Guard that are there, and then the powerful gods still have power because the pilgrimage has come, so they're not going to cause any problems.
Yeah. And, the most interesting part is when they arrive at the baths and, there's just pilgrims walking around and gods striding about, like full on still worshipped gods. And that was almost a glimpse into what the city used to be like. Just humans and gods conversing, bargaining, worshipping. And that was a really cool scene, a real good insight into all of that. One thing about the destruction, before we get too much into the stuff with the gods, is in chapter 27, so a little bit further on, when they get Skedi to fly up and he sees all the ships in the harbour, and that's just another scene of where, there was loads of people trying to flee the city and they were destroyed. And it's that bit where it makes me think that Skedi was involved in that somehow. He hears a voice in his head being like, oh, he's alive. He lives and flies Skediseth and all that stuff. And he has a memory of flying above ships. Is it those ships in the harbour?
This is after the interaction with Arn.
Yeah.
Kind of gives him a few more clues and confirmations about some of his background. There's a moment where it talks about all of the death that white lies can't help to solve or something like that. But
it just makes you wonder if he used to be more powerful because he had some involvement in that destruction. How much was he involved? If Inara, Krea's mother, was involved in that court as well and was there from time to time, is Skedi from around that scene as well?
Yeah.
But so then they're moving through the city and we start having all these interactions with gods leading up to the bars. I think some of those are really interesting. Which one grabbed you the most?
The one that grabbed me the most was where one of them seemed to be about to attack them, and it was this moment where Inara basically said stop, and the god just stopped. And so it was this opportunity, I think, to demonstrate that Inara's force of will was something more than just her connection with Skedi. It was something that she could push outwards. And they meet some really pathetic, like tragic cases where I think there's this opportunity to show humans feeling sorry for gods. It's sort of an inversion of the way it should be, I guess.
Yeah. The thing that struck me with that was, even in those moments, you still feel that there's that danger with those gods. So even with Kelt, the god of broken sandals, when you think about the other two gods they see on this travel, the kind of the shadow wandering around without a shrine, and the one under the lamp, which is the greater threat, they're still dangerous and can warp you and everything. When you have Kelt being sandwiched between these two other more dangerous gods, it kind of puts in the context of like, I wouldn't have given Kelt anything. As much as it was a really sad little figure, this little thing just like poking at her boots, but still, I wouldn't risk it. I'm not going to give gods anything. But then we get to the baths, as we were talking about. There's such a cool scene, and then we get to Arn. So
yeah, and I think the great thing about the interaction with Arn is that she is more self-aware as a god than other gods that we may have interacted with. I think she's got a kind of self-confidence that enables her to conveniently for us be kind of very honest and upfront and kind of give us some truths, but she's intrigued by things. She just wants to be, she almost wants to be a spectator. She doesn't feel threatened. The thing she wants from Inara is a way to just be able to check in on her and see what she's doing.
Is it though?
Really?
Because Kissen even says, this is clearly a minor gift. Who even cares about this? Because at the end of the day, she could check in on her anyway. So it must serve a different purpose. Like that hair that she's given over. And also because we see it from Kissen's point of view, where she's like, oh, she imagines that this hair would have had a little golden glow on it. Because we don't see it from Inara or Skedi's point of view. We don't see what happens when she takes that hair. So it can remain unknown to us. Because what if there was something that kind of like looked a bit funky or weird when it happened? We're viewing through a very specific person's eyes who can't tell us that.
Yeah. I think the really interesting thing that we start seeing is gods giving their reaction to Inara as something different. And they don't know what she is necessarily. But this totally killed my theory about Inara's father dead in the water. I think at this point I was like, okay, that was totally wrong. If you didn't listen to the last episode, I theorized that Aaron might have been Inara's father, but Arn basically says that whoever her father is the source of her power.
And it's some kind of god, right?
Yeah, which I think was your theory.
Well,
so
maybe
yeah, I'll throw my hands up.
Oh, look, I'm happy to say I was wrong about other things. There was me in that last episode thinking like, no, I still trust Aaron. What an idiot I was. But you're right. Like, it's not just Arn, calling her the little unraveler, and then she unravels the curse on Elo at the end. But we also have other little moments which raise other questions. So I'm going to jump forward a little bit. When Aaron is present in the finale and Elo mentions about how Aaron burned down the Krea's house, and he mentions Inara, and Aaron frowns, and it's a really ambiguous frown, like, Inara? Like, who? Or whether it's she doesn't have a daughter, or I thought she'd be dead as well. Why are you talking to her like she isn't dead? And I think there was a thing there that means that there's a greater mystery relating between Inara and Aaron, even though, yeah, I don't think it means that they're father-daughter, but is it that even the king didn't know about Inara being born, even though she was paraded at court? And then, of course, you get Heseth saying, what manner of being are you, when Inara arrives into the fight? Because she's clearly not a human.
You're kind of starting to get a sense of her power. She maybe doesn't realize it yet, but Heseth is surprised. And I love that. I love the whole fact that no one knows what she is. She's something new or something different.
Yeah. So jumping back to Arn, she doesn't just take the hair from Inara. She also wants a favor in the future from Skedi. But then in the private conversation she has with Elo, he gives up the pommel of his sword, which is representative of his connection to Aaron. He's still loyal to Aaron at this point, but he's moving away almost without realizing it from giving up stuff connected to Aaron and moving more towards his connection with Inara and Kissen. And then we have this very good dramatic conversation where Elo effectively reveals to those two what he's going to do, and their reaction is very telling about where their relationship all stands, because they're so invested in involved in Elo and his life, they can't imagine him giving up his life. And I think what's really interesting here is it is this ironic foreshadowing, because of course Aaron wants to become a god, and he's effectively just becoming his first sacrifice on his step to godhood. And he doesn't realize that he is doing it for that.
Yeah, Kissen's ability to kind of be right here is unbelievable, where she kind of calls out the fact that Aaron's not as good a person as Elo thinks he is, and there is potentially a different path. But I will throw out, I felt a little bit good when that quote, "Gods love martyrs," which I picked out from the prologue, and it starts to repeatedly come up, and that idea that loyalty and love kind of means nothing, and it's actually all about sacrifice.
Yeah, definitely. And then
it heats up.
It heats up a lot. Kissen drags Elo away from Inara, and it's like, they're going to have it out with this discussion about him sacrificing himself, and this ends in Kissen and Elo sleeping together. And as we mentioned earlier, did this need to happen? Like, we definitely seen it building.
Yeah, I thought it worked on the basis that it's hard not to kind of allow the intensity of certain other situations to have a bearing on the intensity of the relationship that they have with each other.
That blurring of the lines between all of it. Yeah.
But it was pretty, just for like a couple of paragraphs, super graphic, even just a couple of lines.
That final bit of this chapter, I was just like,
yeah. I was like, I need to have a cold shower before I crack on with the next chapter.
I thought what was interesting here that was established was Kissen almost throws out like an accusation. You know, like, what was it between you and Aaron that was going on? Were you sleeping together? And Elo's response of saying, like, they never were, it was never about that. Now, clearly there was some kind of incredibly close bond, but I kind of like how this book allows to have these different kinds of relationships that can exist to have a similar level of intensity, whether they're platonic or sexual. It's a bit Frodo and Sam from Lord of the Rings. You're like, I love you so much, Mr. Frodo, so much as a friend.
Then we accelerate towards the finale, really, because Kissen wakes up the next morning. Elo has gone to sacrifice himself anyway. She's super annoyed that she let her guard down for a minute, and she goes after him. And Inara, despite being told not to follow, does follow inevitably because she's part of the gang, and that's what you do. She likes Elo. She doesn't want to leave Kissen on her own. She's a bit sick of being told to hide and stay behind. So then we get the twist, and I don't know about you, but I did not see this coming. Obviously, I mentioned in the last episode that I had my suspicions around Aaron potentially being a total asshole, but this is another level.
Yeah.
And it totally caught me by surprise. So I have to say, fair play to Hannah Kaner for that one. And it tied up. I kept trying to unpick it after the twist. I was like, hold on, no, something can't be right there. But actually, when you work it back to the conversations at the beginning, in his bakery, all of that stuff, I was like, yeah, the maths adds up.
And it's because him and Aaron are such close friends, and we know that he knows exactly what to say to Elo to get him to go to this place. You know, show him the point of weakness. He knows that Elo will respond like that, and that eventually he would make his way to these shrines. The one thing, it was like, when he thinks, oh, of course, a fire god, I was like, okay, fine. Yeah. He thought, he was like, a fire god needs to rekindle the flame in the thing. Fine. But then he hears the bell ring, and I was like, oh, okay, because she knew that she could lure him in with the sound of her bell, because, of course, it's a well-known thing, because Kissen had said, I've been to ring that bell, you know, and try and lure her out. So it's established that is a sound that he would already know to hear.
I thought the whole sequence at the end was appropriately kind of epic. It just kept getting more and more intense. There was a little bit of exposition, like bad guys telling the good guys what the plan was all along, a bit, Dr. Evil.
I think that was a conscious choice. You know, that's taking that trope and using it effectively. You know, it's buying the hero's time to get there. It's allowing us to learn about what his secret plan was all along, and also conveys that Aaron and Seth are so convinced that they've won that they're happy to kind of revel in their own arrogance and be like, you didn't even suspect a thing, and aren't we so clever, and now I'll be a god forever, blah, 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 blah. One quick thing, though, is like, just thinking about this, Hestra's involvement here. She's still there, isn't she? It's not just Seth. Hestra, goddess of the hearth, is there. And it made me wonder, when Aaron got his injury, it mentions in the book, you know, Hestra.
How did he know where to find?
Yeah. So was this Seth and Hestra planning this even before Aaron knew that he was going to be part of it?
Yeah, that has literally only just occurred to me now that you've said it, because they'd just gone into some random house where Aaron had taken the blow from Myrta, and Elo had dragged him into a random house, and Hestra had just happened to find them. So yeah, now I'm super suspicious about that.
Yeah. So we have this fight between Seth and Kissen, and it's great. It's a really good fight. There's some really cool moves, like some hacking and slashing. Her like deflecting flames with her blessed cloak so that, she can survive the heat, and then getting up real close to her Seth and then chopping off her nose, and they're taking time to like really throw shade at each other.
Yeah, she says some really hurtful things.
Yeah.
Seth, that is. She really kind of plays on the childhood trauma. I think you get the sense that Kissen is ready to die. She's just trying to hold her up long enough for Inara and Elo to get away and do as much damage as possible.
Yeah. And it brings along this culmination of this, fire versus water vibe that we've had throughout the entire book. Some of the more peaceful, happy moments, they've all been quite water-based. You've had a citizen here again at the end to help her finish off, but Arn has been one of the nicer points. The moment in the lake, the nice bit in the tavern under the waterfall where they're listening to Elo sing. I feel like Kissen is the water side to Aaron's fire side within Elo's romantic life.
Yeah, I like that.
But it ends with Kissen plummeting off a cliff into the water, nice full circle back to the beginning. And that is where I kind of really appreciate the completeness of this as a single book. That's where this is as a standalone story really works for me.
Yeah. And we have yet another climax as well with Elo and Inara and the unraveling of the curse. And I loved this in the audiobook, the moment where she realizes that she has the power and she actually trusts herself to use it. There's just this instinct and this feeling that I think I can see it, I can feel it, and I think I can fix it.
I thought as well, it not only showed us Inara's power, but it also gives us an insight to, I think, where the whole trilogy is potentially going. She is pulling out a poison that is kind of spreading throughout him. She is unraveling knots as she sees it visually. She's going to end up ruling the kingdoms. She's going to remove the insidious, poisonous knots of politics that are riven throughout the country. And it's going to be just that writ large by the end of it.
But also she, because of her power, maybe she can't be controlled by the gods, or she can't be corrupted by the gods in the same way that other people can. So I think you're right. It feels like she's being teed up to be that character.
And at the very end, we get a little glimpse. Guess what? Kissen's not dead. Shock horror. A citizen comes to the rescue. Kissen's still like, naff off. I hate
you. Yeah. Cut your nose off to spite your face. And it's Inara, obviously, that pops into her head just as she's about to accept her fate.
The character growth. She has that thing that makes her want to continue that isn't just hatred and spite. It's, for Inara. And it's a really good way to leave the story. But let's wrap up with some thoughts on the book overall. So one thing that struck me was how our characters live in a world where gods are a very physical reality, but Elo and Kissen particularly, they're effectively atheists. And I feel like it's not often that you get characters like that in worlds where the gods are very physical reality. Everyone's kind of like begrudgingly admitting them. But because there's that transactional nature where if you don't give the gods something, they have less power over you, you can reject them in a much more literal way. Yeah.
And they have very different philosophical views towards their versions of atheism, don't they? Elo's very much of the people should be allowed to do what they want and it's their choice school of thought. Kissen feels much more proactive for obvious reasons in her dislike of gods and desire to rid the world of them.
One thing that I think is really interesting, actually, now that we're talking about how if Inara is a god, right, or some form of god, there was a bit where Kissen says that she doesn't kill, but she thinks to herself that she would commit a murder for this child even though she'd known her for half a month. And I'm thinking, Kissen, without realizing it, is going to become a believer, but just in Inara, willing to commit acts that she'd never thought about before, offering almost sacrifices in the name of Inara.
Yeah. You know, is there going to be this thing linked to that where Inara is already what Aaron is trying to be? And there's these kind of similarities between them, but very obviously big differences in terms of what their motivations are and the way they go about things.
Aaron's going to be so bitter when he realizes that. He's going to be mad. Another thing that we've touched upon, I think, a bit in both episodes that I kind of really grabbed me in this book, and this is partly because of I haven't read a huge amount of modern fantasy, like, you know, stuff released in the last 10, 15 years. The modern approach to queerness in this book was really interesting. Queerness was there in other ones, but it was a fraught characteristic still, kind of reflective of how it was seen in society. But in this more modern take, where it was just a feature of people rather than being their one defining characteristic. You know, you had Elo mentioning his mothers, you had Yatho and Tele being a couple. It was just there, it was just present, and it was so refreshing.
Yeah, it was a feature of society, I think, and it wasn't a thing that was a big deal. But also I think it linked to this idea that strong women were a kind of significant feature of society. There's this thing about it not really mattering that the Queen's children were all from different fathers. There's a kind of role reversal from what our accepted view of society might be.
It's the perfect way to use fantasy, because there is some great fantasy where they're like, well, of course, I'm basing this on Western medieval fantasy, so the women still have to have less agency. This is just, it doesn't really matter about gender at all. It doesn't matter about queerness. It doesn't matter about race. It doesn't matter about any of these things. It's so enjoyable to read a story like that where they don't feel like they have to have these features of the real world, where we still see conflict in so many of these elements, and we can just be like, none of that even matters here.
Indeed, I concur.
Are there any kind of like larger questions that you've got still sticking out that you're pondering?
Just the stuff around Skedi, really, and whether his backstory is going to prove significant to what happens next. My guess is that it will. Other than that, I'm sure there's a million things that we haven't touched on. It's hard in 300 pages to pick up everything over the course of a couple of hours in a podcast.
So my final questions are, Dan, was this a world, seeing as we read fantasy books, we transport it to other realities, did you like this world? I mean, would you even have liked to have lived in it? Because I know sometimes they're horrible, you know, grotesque, negative worlds, but would you like to live in this one, and did you like it?
So in terms of the interactions between gods and humans and the chaos and the impact of that, it doesn't appeal to me as as somewhere to aspire to live. That said, what we just talked about in relation to the equity across society and those types of things, it feels like this kind of progressive.
It's like one of those, but it feels like one of those really weird, arbitrary questions that you see people getting asked on TikTok, where they're like, so would you like complete gender and sexual equality, but also gods run amok among us and kill everybody? And you're like, oh, right, so that's the binary I have to live in.
Yeah, that's the decision you're asking me to make. So I think on balance, I'm going to say I wouldn't want to live in the world. That said, I do like the characters that we've met, and I would like to hang out with Kissen and Elo. I think they both have a good story to tell. What about you?
I think that I wouldn't mind living in this world. If it was me as I know now, suddenly being walked into that world, then I would love to see the mechanics of seeing actual gods, seeing all those powers. Growing up in that world where it's more commonplace and normal, would I appreciate it so much? Would I just want more of a stable government rather than this hyper-capitalist god market of ideas kind of situation? I don't know. But I do love the ideas of those big, grand cities built on waterfalls and stuff. So I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say yes. Throw me in there.
And if you ever got a broken pair of sandals,
I'll go find Kelt.
there's a god that you can go to fix them. So I didn't think of that actually when I gave my answers. So maybe I'll have another think about it.
Because of Kelt, you're on board. And finally, what would you do with this book? We finished reading this now. I know you've got it an audio book, but say you had a physical copy. Would you recommend it to someone? Would you give this book to someone? And would you want it back after you've given it? What's your attachment to this book, and how much would you want to continue to have it?
Yes, so I would recommend it to various people that I know who are fans of fantasy fiction. I think they would enjoy it. I've enjoyed it. I think it's a pretty fast-paced story, and it works on a number of levels: character, plot, twists, all of the action. In terms of whether I'd want it back, one of the things that really attracted me to picking this up was the cover. So I would actually have it back, and I'd like to have it in my collection, because I think one of the coolest things about fantasy fiction is some of the artwork that comes along with it. I'd have it back for my collection. Would I read it again? I'm not massive kind of rereader of books. It has to be something kind of Harry Potter-ish for me to go back and read it again. So I probably wouldn't read it again. But we'll see, because I think Sunbringer and then whatever the third book is called, you never know. That could change it all.
Yeah. I really loved reading this book. As I say, I love the world. I love the story. I'm keen to know what happens next. I have a lot of questions. So I would recommend this. I wouldn't recommend this to like everybody. If someone said, what's a great book you've just read? I don't think this would be the kind of thing that I would go, oh yeah, this is an essential. And I don't think I would ask for the copy back. I'd be like, pass it on. If I found someone who was also into fantasy, I would say, read it, pass it on to someone else. Let's keep that going. Yeah, for me, rereading is a pretty special thing. When I say I'm going to reread something, I enjoyed it so much, that's probably the highest praise. I think I've probably reread less than 20 books that I've gone back and be like, this is an essential one that I will have to experience the storyline again.
Yeah. Rereading is a huge commitment. It's not like watching a film twice that takes you a couple of hours of your time. It's hours and hours. And, there's so much amazing literature out there that you could also be listening to. It's high praise if you reread a book. So that's it for episode 2. And we have wrapped up Godkiller by Hannah Kaner. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thoroughly enjoyed discussing it with you, Sam. If you've enjoyed this, get involved yourself. We're on social media at Escapists Anonymous Pod on all platforms. So come drop us a message. Tell us what you thought. Tell us if you think all of our opinions are stupid and that we're idiots. We want to hear that. We don't care whether it's good or bad. We want to hear from you. Get involved.
I'd love to hear some other people's opinions. This is one of the big things, is we've lived these isolated existences, not being able to talk about much fantasy with anybody. The chance to know what other people thought about it, even just to say you're stupid and you're wrong. I'd love that. That's what I'm looking for, really. So I can't wait to hear what everyone else thought about Hannah Kaner and Godkiller. And even if you're catching up in the future, please message and let us know. Don't think that this is just for these 2 episodes.
Indeed.
So, Dan, we're moving on to a new book. Can you tell us what's the next book we're reading, and up to what point should we read?
Yes, we will be taking a break from the Fallen Gods trilogy. We will be coming on to Sunbringer later in the year, and what we want to do is leave an equal distance between books 1, 2, and 3 of the trilogy, just so that we can spread it out evenly. And the next book that we'll be reading is The Foxglove King by Hannah Witten. The plan is that we will be reading chapter 1 through to the end of chapter 13 to discuss in the next episode. So get reading and join us next time for Escapists Anonymous, the fantasy fiction book club. Goodbye.
Goodbye.